The title of today's talk is Population-Driven Research with Statistical Shape Models, which will be presented by Janelle Schroet and Bart Bozeman of Materialise.
Well, as Brian mentioned, we'll spend some time talking with you a little bit about population-driven design and research with the use of statistical shape models. And if you aren't familiar with Materialise, we do focus on medical 3D printing. And one of the very important aspects of this is what we do in leveraging medical image data as an input for device development. So whether it's standard implant design or patient-matched implant design, we really leverage that image data in new ways. And so today I'll focus a little bit about our involvement in standard device development and research, and really thinking about how to use image data not just to look at individual patient scans, but how you can really leverage an entire patient population. So our goal today is to talk about exactly how we do that with a technology called statistical shape modeling, and how it's helped the device development process, particularly in cardiovascular development, as an input for both simulation and testing. So first I'll give an overview of the technology, what it is, give some examples on how it's been applied in real device development. And then Dr. Bart Bozeman will talk a little bit about his research with a project where he's used shape modeling for TAVR development and how it can link to simulation and to this group. So we hope you find this topic informative to think about how quantifying your patient population in new ways and gain a deeper understanding of testing, simulation, and design choices can be made and how it can impact the population you're looking to treat. So why would we talk about population-driven design to the Living Heart Project community? Number one, we have a shared goal of improving medical device design and providing a realistic and safe testing environment. We're all looking at what is that environment for testing and verification and validation, and how do we get a little bit more realistic. So let's talk a little bit about that realism piece. Mostly when design engineers and testing engineers are working to prove out a device or design concept, they want to test it in a realistic testing environment or simulate it in a realistic environment. And so how do we quantify, or how do we define realistic? Is it using an individual patient scan or maybe a simple tube? But this is one of our goals, is to leverage all of this patient data and get even closer to mimicking reality from pulling from the geometrical data that exists in medical scans. And we do this through population-driven design. So what is population-driven design? Well, it's a way that we use statistics to look at a patient population. And what attributes impact the geometrical shape change across this patient population. It kind of pulls out the human bias to say, to look at the patient's anatomy in terms of length, tortuosity, diameter only, and start to look at the combinations and really what's happening if you were to take your patient population from, say, a small female to a very large male. You know, there's different linkings and different attributes that happen across this patient population, and how can we better quantify this and leverage that data as an input for device development. And so that's really what we see, one of the gaps, or one of the elements that we try to help bridge, is how can we use all of this medical image data that exists in clinics and clinical trials as an input for the design space for standard implants. You know, oftentimes, especially in cardiac devices, it's a very small family of device sizes that has to treat a very large and broad patient population. So how do we make the best choices possible in sizing and you know, population coverage or whatnot to really know that patient population before we actually enter our clinical trial. And so that's really the goal of this, is to really, like I mentioned, leverage it in any kind of phase of the device development process, all the way from feasibility to post-market. So let's get into what is this? What is statistical shape modeling? It's a way, like I mentioned, to really leverage statistics, where we would take a large library of medical scans, say CT or MRI, and create a 3D structure of the anatomy of interest. For example, here I'm showing an orthopedic or a femur. And the first thing we would do is find correspondence across all of the bones here, or the files and everything, to make sure that we have a good understanding of the anatomical references and how they would link together. And we use some things, just getting a little bit into the math, but we'll skip over it and we can always follow up later. We use principal component analysis to then analyze this patient population and really start to look at what are those main attributes that influence shape change, and so that we can start grouping things together. So for example, a summary of this would help us look at, you know, that major attribute of shape change is defined as, say, mode 1, or the major mode of variation. And here in a femur example, you can kind of see that mode 1 is maybe defined by the size of the femur, and you can see it growing. But there's also other things that happen with size. It's not that a small female is just a scaled version of a very large male, for example. They have different loading conditions. So what can we learn about the correlation between different things? For example, the size of the femur and how it links to the angulation of the femoral head here. And you can start to see how that changes. Or in the second mode, you know, what else is really influencing the shape change across the patient population? The width or the diameter of the femoral shaft here, and how it kind of, as it gets thicker, you can also see that the angulation of the femoral shaft starts to change. And so really how principal component analysis works is, let's say we were to try and quantify just humans by their size. And so we plot out their weight versus their height and everything, and here's where we see that distribution. Well, what we would be looking at is maybe we would try and re-quantify it by something like BMI and everything, and that's kind of the fundamental of what we're using. But now if you were to think about that in 30,000 dimensional space or whatnot, now can we really look at much more complex shapes as well as patient populations, and start to look at, you know, what is that shape change and how can we quantify it and better group our population to think about that device and how it's going to interact with population rather than individual patients. So maybe to take this into a couple quick examples before turning it over to Bart. One femoral example is with a company, DJO, where they were at market release with a short hip stem. You can see it here in red, the design, where upon limited market release, they had 6 femur fractures in the first 30 cases. and 2 of their 6 surgeons stopped using it completely and said, you know, you need to resolve this and figure out what's causing these fractures. So they worked with us with statistical shape modeling to start to look at what is their patient population and perform virtual fits of these implants across across their patient population. And what we could learn is, if you actually look at this dark red region here, is there was a very high interference fit with a subset of the patient population. And so upon looking at that, then we could help look at a redesign, taking into consideration all of this patient population information, slightly lengthening the shaft of the implant and everything, but then really making sure that that interference isn't there. And since then, they've done well over 1,700 cases, and the surgeons proclaim that it's one of the easiest tip stems to fit in, and it's solid once it's in the bone. And I know DJO has mentioned that had they looked at this ahead of time, they could have maybe saved $500,000 in lost inventory alone. And so I think that's one way of thinking about, you know, leveraging all of this patient data in new ways can kind of help at the onset. Another study that was done with the FDA was looking at the anatomy across swine, so from 50 pounds to 250 pounds. You know, what's actually changing in this patient population? And so this was a study to kind of look at the aorta and femoral arteries, and how does that change from a patient that's 50 pounds to 250 pounds? Because one of the arms of the FDA has been looking at, you know, how do they help med device manufacturers choose the right animal model, because it might be that they don't necessarily want the same anatomy in an animal to mimic that best mimics the physiologic conditions of a human. And so really studying and understanding the swine model can maybe help them make different choices, or help med device manufacturers make different choices in their animal studies. But in this study, we looked at the anatomy change in swine from 50 to 250 pounds. And one of the things that you can see here is actually, it's not just, like I mentioned, the size that changes, overall size, but you can see there's a correlation between the diameter of the aorta and the diameter of the femoral arteries here, or whatnot, where the diameter actually of the aorta doesn't change very much across this size change in the swine. And so there's just different ways to apply this in kind of your learning of the patient population when we start to think in larger quantities rather than 1 and 2. And so now I'd like to turn it over to Bart to talk a little bit about his research, and like I mentioned, for a TAVR application, and how he's kind of used this and linked it to simulation as well. So Bart, the floor is yours.
Okay, hi all. Thanks, Janelle. As Janelle said, I will delve a little deeper into one of the models we made and the research we have done to bring it to potential application. It's the population model of the TAVI patient population, and what the goal was of this research is to incorporate actually that population variability of TAVI patients in the design and testing process of implant design. So we used the population model as a kind of a virtual testing environment, or we're planning to do that, and use it as an input for simulations in which the implantation can be tested. So to quickly give an introduction into the TAVI domain, probably most of you know the principle, but it's a minimal invasive procedure in which in this case a Medtronic core valve, a self-expandable stent, is positioned into the aortic root, and the stent contains a biological valve that will take over the function of the aortic valve. The minimal invasive procedure has a lot of advantages. Of course, the patient doesn't have to undergo very severe open chest surgery. So patients with comorbidities can be treated as well. Downside is that the surgeon doesn't have that much. Well, is limited in his range of the manipulations and the things he can do when the implant is being positioned. It's quite distant from the groin where the catheter is inserted to the aortic valve, where the actual implantation takes place. So the design of the implant and its functioning during implantation is important for the success of the procedure. And what we would like to do is incorporate the 3D geometry of the patient population into that process of creating those implants. So we started from a data set of patients from the University Hospital in Antwerp. It's 89 patients, which are about half female, half male, who have a high age, an average age of 80 years. They are not recommended for surgeries, which can be derived from these scores, and they have a severe aortic valve condition. So the functioning of the aortic valve actually is threatening their life. So what is done when these patients are treated with a TAVI device? First, they undergo a preoperative CT scan, and then to decide on the path to take and the size to implant. Then the treatment is done, and post-operatively, the implantation is evaluated with respect to leakage using an angiography immediately after the intervention itself, so during the procedure, and an echo 7 days post-op when the patient is leaving the hospital. For research purposes, they also took 27 post-op scans of a subset of these patients, and we will use them later on when we want to validate our simulation using the statistical shape model. So what we did is we used the pre-op CTs to extract the geometrical model of the anatomy of the patient. So we performed segmentation, also separated the chambers of the heart, and generated a 3D model of each of the scans. And then you get a large set of 89 geometries, which vary quite a lot. And in order to make them into a statistical shape model, we need to match them with a mesh that can describe all of them. So as you probably know, the 3D models we use consist of points and triangles, and these points and triangles make up the three-dimensional shape, and will also make up the statistical shape model. But in order to do that, we need to correspond each of these patients to each other in order to have one single mesh that describes all of the shapes, with of course different positions of the points. So conceptually, with stars, you could look at it as being an ordering of the nodes that make up the star, which actually determine the correspondence. But of course, what happens if you have multiple shapes that do not correspond one-on-one with the original shape? Then we do well, correspondence mapping. And in the case of the Arctic route and arch in which we are interested, it's done in two parts. So first, the tubular part of the Arctic route and the Arctic arch is extracted from the 3D geometries. Why make it into a tubular model? Because we will use the tubular shape as an intermediate shape to achieve the correspondence. We cut off the side branches and the main part of the left ventricle of each of the shapes and map the shape onto a tube. So describe it with parametric coordinates of a cylinder and then do that for each shape. And by optimizing the mapping onto the tube and the reverse towards each of the shapes, we can derive the optimal mesh to generate the SSM. And we did something similar for the leaflets then. We mapped each of the leaflets onto a disk, and we mapped the disks then onto each other in order to generate the mesh that that describes each of the shapes in each of the patients. And so by combining those into vectors, so the coordinates of the points, we can then calculate the average quite easily because they all have the same length. And we calculate also the difference matrix, so the difference from the average for each of the shapes. And we have then a description of a shape as a combination of the average shape and the difference matrix multiplied by the coefficient factor. Principal component analysis is then used to extract the main modes of variation. So what does it mean? There's the singular value decomposition of the difference matrix has the modes of variations and then the principal components in it. By doing that, we can limit the amount of parameters that are necessary to describe actually the shape variation, because they are ordered according to the principal components, and they're also linearly independent to each other, so we can vary them independently. This gives then this result for the statistical shape model of the Arctic route. What you see is the average shape and the first three modes of variation. So the first mode contains mainly the size variation, and then the second mode is a bit angularity, which you can see in it, and the third mode is more local rotation in the Arctic route. What we can also derive from those from the SSM is some measures of its quality, of its descriptiveness of the population. So what you see here in the first graph, the compactness is how many modes you need to describe actually all of the shapes in the training set accurately. So with 20 modes of variation, you have you reach an RMS value of you can describe 97% of each of all the shapes in the training set accurately, and the other two give the distance when you include more modes. In the first case, how accurately you can try a specific you can describe a specific shape, and the specificity shows the distance actually between a random shape and a shape that is present in the training set. So what can we do with this model? Well, in case of the Arctic route, in which the TAVI device is implanted, we can generate a large set of shapes randomly by choosing the principal components within the distribution of the population. And so these shapes then give a patient within the boundaries of your training set, and you can use that to perform implantation simulations, for example. And one thing we added to this in order to make it more useful for that application are the calcifications. So we repositioned the Arctic root shapes and the CT images, and we extracted the elements of the mesh that are in a calcified zone. So you have local variations that you can use for well, to characterize the calcifications, and what we did is then use a simple simulation model. So we use these triangular elements as shell elements. We gave them a thickness that varies between case of the Arctic wall 2 millimeters and the leaflets itself are 0.5 millimeter thick. And we also then change the material parameters of the elements that are in the calcified zone in order to, well, have them linear elastic and the region of calcifications. And we used for the soft tissue material a Neo-Korean material. And we did then simulations on actually the shapes that we can reconstruct for the 27 patients we have a post-op scan for. So in order to validate how accurate our implantation simulation are, we used the SSM to fit, well, we fitted the SSM on those 27 cases, and we used that model then to do the simulations. What we used is the Abacus Explicit Solver, and we kept the top and bottom nodes of the ARTA in place as a boundary condition, and we then released the stent gradually in 3 steps. So we moved the top nodes down, in this case in the first step, and then released them to find an equilibrium position. Also did the same with so also released the bottom nodes at the end. The stent, by the way, are beam elements, and it's derived from a micro CT of a 29 millimeter core valve. So for the 27 patients we did simulations for, we then also performed measurements on the stent in the post-op and on the stent derived from the simulations. We had 4 sections, sorry. So at the very bottom, at one stent node higher, so the region where the sealing should occur, so where the surgeon aims to position the stent in the aortic annulus plane, the narrowest section and the widest section. And we saw that in using the model, we had an underestimation of the perimeter, also of the diameter. That was systematic, and you can compare it a bit with the bottom row of numbers, which give an indication of the measurement error on the post-op diameter measurements. What we then also would like to know is, can we, based on these simulations, give an estimation of how well the stent will perform? So can we derive some information on the regurgitation and after the implantation? And we did it by adding to the metal frame the ceiling skirt. Because we don't have an orientation of the device, we only included the ceiling skirt of the where it's a complete circumferentially around the whole stand, and we calculated then based on that ceiling skirt the distance between that surface and the aortic root of the patients. What we then have is a distance map, which you can well see a bit as a topographical map. And what we try to find in this map is valleys, so paths between bottom and top on which through which actually flow could occur. And we calculated those flow measurements and compare it to the regurgitation measurements that were performed post-implantation. And what we see is that we can see some linear connection in the linear relation in the first AR measurement. However, it's not as well defined as we would like to. You can see that the patients with grade 2 have a low max flow value, which is the value we calculate, while it's lower actually than in patients with that which have a grade 1. We can't find any relation in the echocardiographic measurements, unfortunately. So what we have, and this is a bit where my research is currently, is a conceptual framework which we could use to link population modeling with finite element modeling in order to do design verifications. Of course, we would need to have a more accurate simulation if we would like to use it in this way, or a better AR measurement, which both have their limitations. So it's not completely ready yet, but we nevertheless think that it's a useful tool that could be used in research, in future research into device design. And what we would like to do as well is do a bit of a call for feedback to the audience. So what do you think? Is this relevant? Are there things that you see that are missing, and maybe potential cases for this model or for potentially other anatomies as well. So with this, I'm going to hand back control to Janelle in order to wrap up, I think. Okay.
Great, thank you. Yep, thank you, Bart, for sharing that. Yeah, and so I think that, just like Bart just summarized, looking at how these two technologies can be paired together to support the verification and validation process, from gaining more insight into the patient population and then how to use it in your simulations. Number one, in the future, first off, to validate, some additional validation is needed, but then also in the future, how can these two things pair together or whatnot to just advance the type of simulations done in V&V. There we go. So I think that one of the last things that I wanted to wrap up on is really looking at how can statistical shape modeling be used together with Living Heart Project. One of the things that we've seen, or how we've seen it used, is really mapping a current model onto a specific population. So understanding a specific case, let's say if you have a population mapped already and a specific case comes in and it was challenging, finding out why it was challenging, in what ways, rather than just learning that the case was challenging. If you can start to map out the reasons, if there was any anatomic or geometric rationale as to why things didn't go right. You can identify, was it an outlier or was it an average case that we need to consider for future device designs or next generation device designs. Also looking at creating irrelevant variations of the model based on the population data. So did we accurately start with the right patient population? Do we need to think about additional patients that need to be added into the population so that the model accurately represents the target population? Those are all kind of elements or ways that I think shape modeling and assessing the patient population can be used. And we've seen it being leveraged in that testing and verification and validation. For example, how do you create a bench test to really test to the patient population or to your extremes rather than just testing a single patient or an over-idealized patient. We can start to really make considerations in that physical model or whatnot to make sure that it's representative of what you'll see in the patient population and not sometimes what we hear referred to as a Frankenstein model, where we take the worst case parameter from multiple patients and group them together, because that might be so far an outlier that we're no longer testing to reality and everything. And you can see how that would parlay into simulation as well. So as Bart mentioned, we'd love to hear from you guys on how you see this technology linking up with the Living Heart Project as well as verification and validation in general. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and I would like to thank the organizers, Brian, Tom, and April, for inviting us to speak. If you do have any other further questions after this webinar, please feel free to reach out to us. We've listed our contact details here. And I think with that, then I'd like to turn it back over to Brian. Thanks again.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Janelle, and thanks, Bart. With that, I'll close the meeting today, and thanks for attending.